Welcome back to our fabulous American Lit History lectures. The next era that we're going to be looking at is entitled Realism. It takes place roughly from 1855 through 1880, but in reality it goes all the way to the end of the century. But we're going to handle that end of realism in our next lecture entitled Regionalism. But as you can see by the pictures, realism focuses on the time period of the Civil War and then what happens afterwards. Before we move too far into this, though, I want to focus on two of the writers that we talked about, I think, a little bit last time towards the end. And these writers were in between the movements of Romanticism and Realism. They sort of straddled both worlds. Emily Dickinson, the poet and the recluse, and you probably read some of her poems in your classes in the past. Walt Whitman also is our most famous and most influential poet. He's worldwide known as being sort of our revolutionary voice in literature. So Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson both are involved in this time period, and we'll talk a little bit more about Whitman at the end. By this time, right before the Civil War, we have really felt as though we've established some strong roots. Before this time, we were working off of old models, European models for government, for literature, and now we have finally come into our own. We've realized that we are our own nation. Our federal government is quite strong at this point. In the north, the cities are thriving. The industrialized cities are thriving. Factories are very successful. And in the south, so far, the plantations are thriving. However, the increased demand in cotton has made it economically a necessity for there to be slaves. And unfortunately, that instability is what causes a lot of the turmoil that leads us up to the Civil War. And we find that we are a family with irreconcilable differences. That means we cannot come to an agreement. We have to just cut our losses and split up. Unfortunately, the split means that we are going to have a huge national conflict. And so we don't have anybody to referee for us there. One of the major conflicts, as you will learn in your American history classes, yes, slavery was a big deal. There were a lot of people who were opposed to it and who wanted to abolish it, especially those transcendentalists we talked about from the last lecture. However, the bigger issue was about the rights of the individual, something that really our nation had been founded on. We fought for our rights to be free, for our rights to make our own independent decisions. And what was starting to happen was the South was feeling that economically and socially, there were laws and rules that were being put in place from a federal standpoint that affected the entire country, that as individual states, they should be able to control and make policies and decisions and laws themselves. And so really one of the big things we were founded on was our individuality is now coming back to bite us, because there are questions of those individual rights, in this case states' rights as individual states, and do their needs get to take precedence over the whole society, and who should be governing the whole society and who should be governing just the states. So even though we joined together to win the Revolutionary War, now we're starting to pull apart again and say, wait a minute, I don't like the laws that you're instituting in Maine. I don't think we really need those. Those don't really apply in South Carolina, and vice versa. And so we have some really huge conflicts. And then to further complicate things, we have a country that's growing. And so we keep adding new states. And as we add new states, the slave question comes up, because now the abolitionist voice has become quite strong. And so whenever we get a new state, the question is, should this state be slave or should this state be free? And that's how we get the Missouri Compromise. And again, you're going to be learning all about that in your history classes. But the turmoil, the conflict is there, and it is growing. And finally, it explodes. On April 12, 1861, in Fort Sumter, the bombing begins, and that is the beginning of the Civil War. And what we see now is a whole new level of dysfunction. We see family against family, we see cousin against cousin, we see father against son, you name it, there are conflicts. And there are states in our country that end up sometimes being border states, and they become basically a microcosm of the larger conflict. The state of Missouri is one such state where the people from the northern part of the state were really sympathizers for the North, and the people from the southern part of the state were sympathizers for the South. In fact, Mark Twain's brother signed up to fight for the Union Army, and Mark Twain signed up to fight for the Confederates. He only lasted a couple weeks, and he went AWOL and never went back and went out west. But what we see, especially in the state of Missouri, is neighbor battling neighbor and neighbor turning neighbor in, and we have marauding bands of outlaws and outlaw soldiers and vigilantes that are really just decimating the state of Missouri and this other states as well that are on the border. And we see, just as it says here, a whole new level of dysfunction. Well, we're going to just skim right over the rest of the Civil War. We know that it happens, and again, you're going to cover that in your history classes. What we're involved in here and what we really want to concentrate on here is what happens afterwards, because our time period of literary realism encompasses really not maybe a lot of years, but certainly a lot of activity and a lot of experience. And so we have the Civil War. It ends. The country is in, especially the South, is in great disrepair, but we've got to move forward from this point, and we have something called Reconstruction that goes on. And we also see that after the Civil War, which is economically one of the reasons why we had the Civil War, was because of the North-South economic disparity, the North becomes even more prosperous, and those big cities get even bigger. We have great migrations of populations of the South fleeing because of the depressed conditions and going up to those northern cities. The South is not really very prosperous. In fact, if you've ever been to certain areas in the South today, you find that there's not a whole lot of money even now today. The Reconstruction efforts sort of failed in many respects from many people's perspectives. And so the South is not doing well, but they were beaten. So they have to try to crawl back out of the hole, and they're not very successful at it. But as prosperous as the North is, we have some more growing problems. And actually, they were problems before, but now they're just getting worse. And those problems are, we have a lot of poor working conditions in the factories, in the northern factories. In fact, there's a novel called The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, that focuses specifically on meatpacking factories in the city of Chicago. However, that particular situation could be applied to a lot of the factories. And what was happening was the large factory owners were paying little to nothing for the factory workers, making them work extra long hours. They didn't have a lot of the protective regulations that will keep them safe in their working environment, as well as there were not really any age limits. So we have lots of child labor happening for families to be able to support themselves. So a lot of the prosperous elements of the North are on the backs of these very poor factory workers in those cities. We do go back to business, however, and despite the fact that we have a lot of disparity of wealth, we have a lot of poor factory workers and rich factory owners, we also see that by and large the middle class of America begins to grow even more. And what Mark Twain termed our time period is the Gilded Age, or the Golden Age. And basically he said, we are focused now more on what we have and what we can have and what we can buy. We become very much a consumerist sort of society. Obviously, we're more so now, but this was kind of the beginning. And Mark Twain looked around, this is a man who grew up as a poor barefoot boy on the banks of the Mississippi River in Missouri, and he'd really not seen anything like the growth of materialism. And so he branded this age the Gilded Age, and it sort of stuck. And industry does indeed thrive. Not only does industry thrive, but we have some major technological growth going on in our country. Lots and lots of inventions. And we have the railroad. We have somebody who invented the typewriter, which makes communication, and ticker tape, which makes communication even more effective and efficient. We have the telephone, talking about communication, the light bulb, and cars. Yeah, during this time period, towards the later end of this time period, there are a few people who are driving around in automobiles, not a lot, but it is definitely going to be a growing piece of technology. And so we have a lot to be proud of and a lot of innovation to be focused on. We have then, because of some of that rapid technological growth, we have just rapid growth in general of some of these large monopolies. You'll learn about a lot of these in your history class, but we have a group of people that were branded the robber barons. And the robber barons were basically people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and those of that ilk who, well, that man there has money to burn. And these people certainly did. And these names are still well known in our community today. And we have the railroad moguls and the steel moguls and the lumber barons we had up here in our part of the country. In fact, if you go to the James J. Hill House in downtown St. Paul, you can tour a lumber baron's home. They've somebody who made his money off of the lumber industry. And why these people were able to be so successful was they were able to maintain a monopoly of their businesses, and it wasn't until the Sherman Antitrust Act that they broke them up just a little bit. But boy, they had quite the control over a lot of the wealth in the country. As it turns out, though, we also start to have the railroads connecting the country. So no longer, if you have a cousin who lives in Maine and a cousin who lives in California, there might be the opportunity that you can actually go meet him someday or her and have a conversation and see their part of the country, because the railroads is starting to try to put together or create unity for a country that had been split apart during the Civil War. And we have the Wild West. This is the time period, and the one following it are the time periods of the cowboys and the frontier and the exploration. We purchased this land, the Louisiana Purchase, but now and the Civil War sort of stopped us from doing too much westward expansion. Well, the Civil War is done. Now we can go back out and we can explore what our big, vast, open country has to offer for us. In addition to that, we have quite the increase in immigrants, probably bordering on one of the biggest influxes of immigration. There are several time periods in our history where the immigrants come in at a higher rate, and this is one of those. And so Ellis Island becomes pretty busy during that time period. With realism, we find that, nope, no more romanticism involved. And remember how I talked about one era can be a reaction to the era that came before it. So we see that with realism. These are some of the traits of realism. Make sure you know these. With realism, especially when we're talking about literature and music and art, we have a very anti-romantic sentiment. And you can imagine why that would be. We have just engaged in one of the worst national conflicts that we've ever seen, and certainly I don't think we can equal it in the world today. We lost more of our people in the Civil War than we ever did in the Revolutionary War, actually than any of the wars that we've had combined in our country to this date. And so there's really not a whole lot to be focused on, reason to be focused on the imagination and the supernatural. We want to keep it real here. And we find that characters, people, become much more important than plot. And that also is reactionary. I mean, when you're a member of the war and you're just a number, you're just a soldier, as a reaction to that, you want to pull people out and you want to say, hey, let's focus on that one person and talk about how that one person is important. Again, we're realizing the power of our democracy. We've survived yet another monumental, unprecedented conflict and come out on top. Again, democracy is working. We find characters acting on their environment rather than reacting to what's going on. And again, I think that is a counter-reaction to the Civil War. And this is one of the biggest, most important themes that we're going to find in our realism era, and that is the appearance versus reality theme. And we'll visit that again in just a moment. We also see with the realism stories that plots emphasize the norm or the value of daily life. And when you've just come through a horrible war, you want things to go back to normal. You want things to be boring. And we find that a lot of the stories during the realism time focus on just everyday normal life, like mowing the grass. We also find, not only with ordinary situations, that we have ordinary characters, and we take those ordinary characters and we kind of start to pick them apart and look at them more in depth, as in sort of man can control his own destiny. With the advance of science, we're again acting a little bit like the Age of Reason, where, hey, we can figure this out. If we can create the light bulb in a car, we can certainly figure out the answer to all of our problems. With realism, the message of the story is the point. We really are going to get a theme here. And the two types of writing that are going on are for entertainment and for instruction. Writers here, and we'll talk about this more with regionalism, focused on what they were most familiar with. They focused on what they knew. And they also focused on what was real, what they could see, feel, hear, touch, and understand from a very logical standpoint, and that's that scientific and technological influence coming into play there. And again, I'm going to reiterate the appearance versus reality, because as logical as we can be, sometimes realism writers like to give us a little trick at the end of their stories. So we might think things appear to be one way, when in reality they turn out to be something completely different, and we also call that irony. So we're going to see a lot of irony in realistic writing. All right, with regards to what we've been kind of following along in a parallel fashion with Puritanism and with Romanticism, let's look at the realism philosophies. They relied on reason and logic. They behaved in moderation. With romanticists, they sort of went over the top, and with the realists, no, let's just keep things in check and monitor how things go before we make big rash decisions. They found evidence of their beliefs in science, again, makes sense with the technological advances. They believed their central force was society, that we made it through this war, we can solve our problems. They talked about what was practical and what they could learn. And they were, as it turns out, pretty optimistic about where they were and pretty optimistic about what they were going to be able to do. They believed they were citizens now, not just of this little country, but they began to branch out, and they believed, hey, we're citizens of the world, and we really can make a difference and have a voice and be a presence in the big wide world. And in fact, one of our most important American voices is Mark Twain. And this is the point in time when I can tell you that now, finally, with Twain, and in a second we'll talk about Whitman, we have our first legitimate, unique American voice. He told America's story in America's voice. He used American speech patterns, American language, American style. And Mark Twain was a journalist, so he did this very well. It came naturally to him. He got his start as a journalist, and then he ventured into being a humorist. He was sort of our first stand-up comedian, to be honest with you. We wouldn't have people like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert today without political humorists like Mark Twain really blazing the trail, and he certainly did that. He traveled around all over the world, all over the country, delivering these stand-up routines. That's what we would call them today. He wrote Huckleberry Finn, and Ernest Hemingway says of Huckleberry Finn that all American literature starts with Huck Finn. Finally, we have Walt Whitman, and he is our other American voice that is quite unique. He created basically a new style of poetry. Up until this point, thousands of years, we'd had the same types of poetry, and Walt Whitman walks into the scene, kind of this roughneck from the East Coast and the New England area, and said, hey, let's make this thing American. Let's do something different. different that the world has never seen, and he created the style of poetry that we know as free verse. Walt Whitman was a staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the Union cause, served tirelessly as a volunteer during the Civil War, and really put himself out there as a poet. He was controversial. He really rattled people's cages, if you will. He made people uncomfortable, and he liked to do that. He experimented with new forms, new rhythms, and new subject matter. He was pretty risky for a writer during this time period. All right, well, let's bring this to a close. I want you to stay tuned because your regionalism next lecture is coming up next, and it's going to be really about kind of a tag on of this time period, more of the same, more specialized, and you can see the little cowboy here. We're going to talk more about regional differences, as is in the name, coming up, so stay tuned, and thanks for listening.